First of all, I don't know how to follow up on what we just experienced downstairs today, so I hope that was inspiring and you got something good out of it, and I hope that we can kind of build on that and have a good discussion today. I'm Jeff Case. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm a lot of things, but the area of suicide, especially within the marginalized populations, has been kind of my life's work. Well, my professional work, I should say. So I'll kind of go into a few things really fast, and part of this presentation is personal for me because of the work that I do and the places that I'm at. So I hope that you can kind of find value in this as well. Even though there are some specific populations that I work with and I kind of address, this goes beyond just these populations, right? The experiences of military veterans are applicable to anyone, any veteran of life. And so there's a universality in some of these things that I hope that you can kind of take away from. And I encourage questions and participation. If I'm at the end of this and I've said every word here today, then I have failed as a presenter. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. We will ask that you ask your question or make your comment into the microphone. That way it gets picked up by the streaming services for those who couldn't be here. But I wanted to kind of just, let's see, outline. Oh, goodness, okay. Okay, just a little bit of an overview. And part of this has to do with some of the unique things that we'll be talking about. I will be applying the Joyner interpersonal model for understanding suicide, and I'll kind of explain what that is for those who are not aware. But a lot of people this is one of the more famous models for understanding suicide and suicidal behavior. We'll kind of go into that. And just sort of some of the different, how this breaks down and how this kind of applies to different folks. One reason why I think this really matches well with transition is because our military veterans are in a constant state of transition. They're transitioning in, transitioning out, trying to reemerge back into what we call like polite society. And that's an ongoing process for a lot of our folks. A lot of veterans as well have faith transitions that they're going through. They say there are no atheists in foxholes, but that is untrue. A lot of atheists are made in foxholes, and sometimes people do find God as well in foxholes, and everything in between those two realities. So this is a process of transitioning. Within the LGBTQ community as well, it's an ongoing process of transitioning and understanding oneself. And the transition can often look like just relating to kind of self with persons, with other people in your life, with relationships, self with God, or self with any sense of kind of spirituality. So there's ongoing transitions with all these things. And at these intersections, we find places where if the transition is not going well, hopelessness can kick in, relationships can be lost, and we see an increase in suicidal thinking and suicidal behavior when those things start happening. And I'll kind of play all that out together. If you have questions, please feel free to kind of ask. I will say this kind of covers some of these things. There are some unique challenges to minority groups, veterans, LGBTQ, and other racial minorities as well. That can lead to an increase in suicide. I was an active duty psychologist in the Army. I served for 8 years. And during my time in service, the military population suicide rate had usually been about half that of the civilian suicide rate. So military was about 10 per 100,000. The civilian rate was around 20 per 100,000. But sort of coincidentally, the year that I was in Iraq, I was serving as the behavioral health officer for an infantry brigade. That number started matching civilian rates of suicide. And we knew that we had a real problem because it represented a doubling of the suicides within the military population. We know that the veteran population as well has had some spikes in recent years, kind of a number of factors are at play. Some of this has to do with the aging Vietnam veteran population that are feeling hopeless as they get older that things will ever get better because it's been 50 years and it hasn't gotten better yet. So hopelessness, put a pin in that concept. But also a lot of the younger generation of veterans that were coming out of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, people were surviving things that in previous wars they would not have survived. And this will kind of play out on stuff as well. I think it's a miracle that people are surviving things that they wouldn't have otherwise survived, but there are consequences to that survival that we need to address and be aware of in our faith communities and in our mental health practices or coaching practices. So we'll kind of go over some of these things because this really will kind of inform some of the things that we're kind of doing. So I had a couple suicides early in my career. This is a tent that I had co-opted and made into a mental health clinic. It wasn't very private, but it worked. But while I was in Iraq, a young man that I worked with very briefly had a relationship end suddenly that led to the loss of his life. And when it was someone that I didn't know well, I just met once. And I thought about this, the loss of a relationship. How can a breakup lead to a suicide? And it kind of shook me a little bit. And then about a month later, another soldier that I knew quite well and had been working with on a weekly basis through our entire time in Iraq, he went home from Iraq before I did, as we were kind of transitioning out. And I knew him quite well. And when he got home, the conditions of the transition back to his world were not favorable. And despite all the planning that we had done and all the discussions we had had, he ended his life by suicide as well, about a month after the first. And so I had these two kind of right in a row that started to really kind of shape how do I view issues of suicide, and what is my role in this? And in one case, my role was pretty small. The second one, a more substantial role. And what does this mean? And then I had a third. And this came about a year after that with a young man who had already attempted suicide twice. We'd gotten him back on a good track. Things were kind of going well. We had things really well in place, and I thought, okay, I got this now. I understand this. And then he died about 36 hours after our last session. And then again, I had to sit. What's going on that I'm missing? Am I missing something? And I'm the kind of person, if you know me, high level of conscientiousness, everything is my fault, right, and my responsibility. And that's not a good posture to be a therapist under, because the weight is too heavy. The burden is too heavy. And so I had to really kind of sit and understand this better. And it kind of motivated me to really get into this world that when we're working in the space of suicidality, it's not business as usual. And I wanted to know more. So I was able to apply for and get accepted into a postdoc fellowship that addressed trauma and suicide. And I studied that for a couple years. And I've had some interesting experiences, but that's, it's good to have these kind of frameworks in place to understand. And I'll tell you, this is what got me in my boss's office. After 3 suicides, they start to wonder what the hell is going on, Captain Case, report. And my boss's boss wanted me to give him all of my patient files so that he could review them, right? Which is against the law. And I try to communicate that effectively. The medical consultant to my boss's boss told me, when the boss hears no, it's a bad day. And I'm like, Mike, it's going to be a bad day. That's an illegal order. I'm not bringing my patient files in to the colonel. But what I did bring was my theoretical understanding of suicide, and my framework, and my triage, and the risk assessments that I conducted, and the theological, or the theoretical framework, I guess it could be theoretical framework that I was operating under. And then he looked at that and he goes, well, Captain Case, it looks like we just need to listen to you better. I'm like, yeah, that's probably true. But I appreciated that when you have that understanding of what's going on, not only is it a good protective factor for us as healers and those that work in this space, but it's also useful for, sometimes you do get brought in and your stuff gets reviewed. Being a career government worker, I still work for the VA, they like to review stuff. And I appreciate that, because for me at least, the reviews have been informative and educational, not punitive, because of the foundation that you kind of work under. So things that I learned pretty early on in that time. So this is one of the models that I think is kind of the most applicable, and it stood the test of time. David Joyner once said that people die by suicide because they want to and they can. Now this sounds kind of crass and vulgar, but he's not wrong. Because there is a capacity to do it and a need or a compulsion to kind of act in this way, right? So there are some constructs that he postulated that have since researched and have kind of stood the test of time. And these are, psychologists love to make up words, so I'll kind of break this down. But the idea of thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness, that taken together, these things start the process of thinking suicidal thoughts. And then the acquired capability is the capacity to cause harm to oneself, which is, there's a part of your brainstem way, way back here that's super deep, deep in your subconscious that is protective and doesn't want you to cause harm. And to overcome that barrier requires this acquired capability to overcome this particular barrier. And I said we're going to talk about hopelessness because that becomes a mitigating factor within these things. So my relationships are falling apart. I'm a burden on others, and I don't see any way out of it. I don't see a way forward. Because I'm a visual learner, this is a good graphical representation of this particular model. We know that kind of starting with those first two ideas, perceived burdensomeness and thwarted belongingness. The idea that perceived burdensomeness in this case is defined as the sum value of my death is greater than my life. People are better off without me. It's kind of a common misconception for people to say that suicide is a selfish act. And I would say that the reverse is more likely true. There are cases, I think, where people may use suicide as a way to get out of something. But for most people that I've encountered that are in this suicidal headspace, they honestly believe that their death would benefit the people around them. One soldier came in and he had a plan for suicide because he thought, I could work the next 10 years of my life and not make $400,000, but if I were to die, my wife would have that $400,000. My death is worth more than my life. I lied to him that day and I said, well, if you die by suicide, the Army won't pay it out. That was a lie. I had to keep him alive just long enough to start helping him kind of process this. I'm not above lying to people. In fact, that's kind of what I shouldn't say lie. In that moment, I felt like that was the right answer. But he felt like he was more of a burden than an asset. And he was using just dollars, right? I needed some time to help him see his own worth and his own value. And so I did lie that day. But for some people, and this happens a lot within faith communities with veterans kind of coming back, I think especially in a population like in Utah, one of my Vietnam vets told me that he was an infantryman in Vietnam. He went through the jungles, he saw stuff, he did stuff, he was witness to things and atrocities. And this poor guy was a 19-year-old from Cache Valley. He had a very quiet, idyllic childhood, adolescence. The world that he thought he knew was shattered in the moment that his boots hit the ground in Vietnam. And he came home with that and he carried that. And when he got back into his mother's kitchen, he said, I tried to tell her some of what I carried, and she stopped me and she goes, hey, isn't it enough that you survived? You don't need to bring that negativity into our valley, right? He was a burden. He saw himself as a burden on his mother, and so he locked up those stories very tight in the vaults in the back of his brain. He worked 50 to 60 hours a week, and then at 70, when his body was breaking down and he was forced to retire, the brain said, hey, buddy, we've got some talking to do. And I'm glad he came in. But when people are coming back, and in the faith and in the populations that you guys have in your congregations, for those who are here that are faith leaders, you will have people that have veteran status that are coming back, and they may look at faith in a different way. A lot of folks come back and they're very resilient. They've experienced stuff, they bend, and then they kind of came back to center again. And in fact, we see that a lot with folks who have gone to war zones, that resiliency honestly is the more common response. But you don't look at the world the same way that you used to. And so, again, there may be this idea that I don't fit in my congregation. I talk with a lot of my vets about bringing their service animals to church and how people give them a look and they give them wide space. Like, I see you have your service animal. You're the crazy vet. I'm just going to kind of walk all the way around you, and they don't engage, or they don't, and then the vet doesn't feel like they feel like they belong either. And in some cases, it's in the person's mind, and because it's a perception, right? It's a perception that you're a burden and that you don't belong. With our LGBTQ population as well, the same thing kind of happens when they, were raised kind of on a heteronormative cisgender understanding. And as you go through the process of understanding yourself and kind of coming out, all of a sudden you're like, well, then what does this mean? Because it doesn't fit the narrative that I've heard about in my Sunday school lessons as a child, or it doesn't match what I see in my congregation. So then there's a transition, and then perhaps, do I belong? Do I still fit in? And that's the fear. I may not fit in anymore, right? And so as a person that's kind of coming out, it's an ongoing process, probably for the rest of their lives. And at each stage in this, we're going to find elements of belongingness and burdensomeness in others. And we'll talk mostly about that. The acquired capability has to do with, again, the ability to enact violence on oneself, and that often takes practice. So for an individual who may attempt suicide through cutting, you might find a lot of smaller other cuts on their body as they kind of acquire that capability to do the big one, right? Or with my vets, the most common method of suicide is firearms. And when they become very familiar with firearms, and it's kind of why we have high rates of suicide deaths among the police force, as well as military and veteran, because they're very comfortable with firearms. And they've been practicing, they know how to shoot it, they know how it works, they know how it feels. And even with that, my vets that have told me that they have either attempted suicide by firearm or have gone down that road, they take a lot of practice. They practice firing without a round in the chamber to see if they could do it, right? Or they just sort of hold it in their hands and kind of feel the weight of it. And they're acquiring that capability to kind of pull that trigger. So with these folks, we're always going to be asking sort of in that place of what practicing, or have you been practicing, rehearsing the suicide? Because we know that it's hard to come back from a gunshot wound, right? And more common within the civilian population to use overdose attempts or other means that are more survivable. One of my poor guys, he had 4 different attempts. His final attempt was attempted at hanging himself, and the beam broke and he broke his leg. And he said, I suck at dying. I should try living instead. And it was for him a paradigm shift where he realized that he really sucks at dying, and he committed to living in that moment. And I thought that was kind of an interesting response. And so I helped him figure out how to keep living. So kind of broken down, thought of belongingness, social connectedness is a basic human need. And we find this theologically, right, throughout Scripture, throughout faith traditions, that us together is more powerful than us in isolation, right? And so in most faith traditions, it talks about the need for the collective, the need for the coming together. As societies, as we've evolved, right? We do better in groups than on our own. In fact, when we develop cities and agriculture, then we can develop arts and music, and literature, and we develop things that not only help us survive but help us thrive as a species. So coming together is really important. It's a basic human need. But when that gets thwarted, right? And we look at this as kind of the absence of reciprocally caring relationships. So in some cases, you give more than you get back, right? A number of my vets kind of describe this process, and I've had a number of queer patients as well that also kind of describe this, that they try to put out love and they don't get it back. It's not matched. And so they end up either being drained, or that idea, again, that they're more of a burden, right? They kind of lead to each other. We look at loneliness, and I think loneliness is definitely a silent killer, right? The night spent alone, especially, boy, that nighttime alone is really quite difficult. And a lot of suicide attempts occur late at night when it's dark and you can't see very clearly, like literally or metaphorically. The perceived burdensomeness, I've kind of covered that a little bit. We do know that that burdensomeness, if we're looking at suicide notes of those who die by suicide and those who survive or have less lethal attempts, a lot of times that burdensomeness was in the notes. My third suicide that I described, he left a 14-page letter. And in it was full of these ideas of not belonging. He didn't fit in, right? And he hadn't fit in for most of his childhood or adolescence. And this idea that he was a burden, right? That he brought people down. That was an interesting moment. The last page of his letter was for me to read. And that's kind of how I got access to it. And it was beautiful and sad at the same time. But that not feeling, that connection, that burdensomeness, right? So One part of acquired capability that I want to bring up as well has to do with people that experience chronic pain, which is, again, very common in the veteran population because bodies are broken and not all pain can be medicated or treated back down to a zero, right? So they learn to kind of live with pain. I had my primary care checkup yesterday, actually, and the doc asked me about my pain level, and I'm like a 2 or 3. It's pretty normal. You just kind of walk around with the back and the shoulder and the knees, typical veteran pain. Right? And you sort of like learn to live with that. I didn't even notice I was in pain until she asked me if I was in pain. I'm like, yeah, probably. Right? So, but living with chronic pain allows you to increase your pain tolerance, meaning that you are more, it's easier for you to carry out lethal attempts or harm to yourself. Right? One of the VA's current terminology has to do with self-directed violence. As sort of a suicide attempt, self-directed violence. To do that, you have to acquire that capability to engage in that behavior because everything in your brain is like, don't do it, don't hurt yourself. Any questions or before we kind of apply this more specifically? Yes.
I'm wondering how the autistic population would fit into these categories as well. My own experience in my church is with autistic population is that maybe it's not necessarily suicidal ideation, but it's maybe a desire of non-existence. That's how it's formulated. And I see a lot of things here that would match what I've heard from this specific group. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I will confess, because my population is primarily military and veteran, I have not had much clinical experience with autistic or people that are on the spectrum, just very limited. So I think that's a really interesting kind of way of looking at it from their perspective, that it's sort of a non-existence rather than a need to enact self-directed violence, perhaps. Yeah, so, but I can certainly see like how that perceived burdensomeness, thwarted belongingness, autism is often marked by difficulty connecting or forming reciprocating relationships, right? There are those who can kind of learn the rules of social reciprocity, but it never becoming organic to them. Is that kind of your perspective? Yeah, so I could sort of see how that lack of reciprocating or mutually beneficial social interactions could lead then to the suicidal thoughts. But again, this is not a population that I'm 100% familiar with. There's a question in the back, yes? You'll get your steps in today.
Are you going to talk about how you can help someone, a family member or someone else you care about, who you can see is feeling disconnected because of LGBTQ issues in their life and feeling different, and you can see them distancing themselves from you?
Yes, absolutely. So we'll be kind of getting to that. And I should say I'm also gay and LDS. As well as a military veteran. So these are all, I didn't make the slide deck for me, but it sometimes just works out that way, doesn't it? Because all these things do sort of match into that. We'll talk about sort of the things that we can do, either from a mental health perspective or from a faith leader perspective. Because again, from the LGBTQ perspective, there are congregations that are more affirming and some that are less affirming, and that's going to load onto that sense of belongingness, right? Does my experience kind of match the experience of those around me? And it will create some level of dissonance. And I think a lot of the work that we do is helping someone resolve that dissonance, right? Or sitting with them until they sort of find their way out. And I often tell people that because of my role as a psychotherapist and as a psychologist, I'm not going to give anyone any answers. I shouldn't say that. Sometimes I'll give them a very direct answer, but most of the time, my office is just the space for them to sit and experience that dissonance, and as long as possible, right, until there's a good resolution. I went to a concert once. They did Beethoven's Fourth Symphony, and then intermission, and then Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. If you're familiar with these two, you've probably never heard of the Fourth Symphony. I doubt anyone in this room could hum a line from it. I cannot. It's very cute, it's fun, it's happy. It starts happy, it's happy and slower and soft, and then it's happy and louder at the end. But it's sort of a thing, right? Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, however, starts off in a pretty dark, negative space, and there's tension. And Beethoven is great at holding tension and just sitting with it, sitting with it, sitting with it. And then all of a sudden, you hear this like chord, this dissonant chord, and it kind of grows and grows in the third movement, grows and grows, and then all of a sudden, doom, the fourth movement. If you haven't listened to the whole thing, go home and listen to it. Because it takes you on a journey of really kind of holding this dissonance as long as possible. You think, I can't bear one more measure of dissonance, and then this triumphant arrival. Right, and all of a sudden, that's glorious. That's why I think that one has much more notoriety than the fourth, my personal opinion. So holding or being willing to kind of sit in that place of dissonance, right? So if someone is LGBTQ in your congregation and they're struggling with that, any quick, short answer, and I've sat with bishops, I am LDS, so I've sat with bishops who want to give me very quick, short answers to resolve my pain. They see that I'm in pain, and their humanity compels them to want to resolve that pain. That's not our job, right? It's to honor the pain and have them sit with that. And if you can kind of sit in that dissonance, the most miraculous stuff comes out of it, right? And sometimes you sit in it so long you don't think you can bear anymore. And I think that in those depths, it was beautifully articulated this morning, but the depth of that despair and that dissonance will be the depth of the arrival when you like have your moment, your aha moment. Right? But we want to keep people alive long enough to have that, okay? And that's the tricky part. That's kind of where, with suicide prevention, we're always in that space of, I don't want to fix this for you quickly, but I also know that eventually you're going to grow tired of this, and that's going to increase the risk of suicide, right? And so we will get into that. If I haven't answered it adequately, then say, Jeff, you didn't do it yet. And we'll get back to that, because that's kind of the whole point of here. We always have stats. So suicide is the fifth leading cause of death among sexual minority veterans in particular. 82.5 per 100,000 person. It's more than double that of the general veteran population. I will say we have made some good inroads within the veteran population. That 22 a day is down to 17 a day. And the vast majority of those are still people who have never sought mental health care. So as leaders, again, I would hope that you would sit with the members of your congregation as you can, but also to encourage activation or actively participating in mental health counseling, right? And let that be part of your ministry, is advocating for the mental health work. So just a few of the other things that are kind of here. We know that the lived experience of LGBTQ veterans in particular can reflect sort of a process of dehumanization, right, that don't fit the dominant culture. So I enlisted in 1995 in the National Guard. I did go in as a musician, so I was not the typical door-busting soldier, but the flute player. I always say that I got into the Army the gayest possible way. But I also caveat that with the fact that every time I did my job in the military, I got a standing ovation. And there's not a rifleman out there who can say the same thing. Although we should probably give them standing ovations as well. But Don't Ask, Don't Tell had just been implemented in 1994, right? Which was a far cry better than the I solemnly swear that I'm not a homosexual, sign your name here. That was worse. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was like, oh, we can live with that for a little while. And luckily when that was finally repealed. But there was a dominant narrative at the time that made it so that the belongingness was very difficult for LGBTQ members, right? And again, we find this in religious circles as well as other cultural circles, that makes it so that the connectedness and the belongingness can become quite difficult, right? So I knew my lines, I knew what I had to say, I knew how I had to act because I'd memorized my lines from years of practicing, right? But again, it's sort of this dehumanization, because even though Don't Ask, Don't Tell was in place, it didn't mean that homophobia wasn't openly expressed, right? And when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, homophobia didn't get repealed. And then we're at a whole different issue with the trans troops and trans veterans, because I gotta tell you, man, they're on quite a yo-yo roller coaster that feels wholly unfair. But that's neither here. Well, that is here, that is now, and we ought to be advocating for those who don't have that voice, especially for those who transitioned and now are punished for that. They're now coming to the VA seeking services. And so we're seeing kind of an uptick in care for trans folks. And also being mindful of what care we are allowed to offer, because now that's being more strictly stipulated. But all this stuff kind of adds to that sense of, do I matter? Does what I believe matter? You know, back in that tent in Iraq was the first time I ever had a trans person sitting in my office, a trans male, assigned female at birth. And I'm going to use she, her pronouns because that's what she asked to use, because it was 2009 and she had to. Her hair was as short as she could possibly get it without getting in trouble, right? She would ace bandage her breasts as tightly as she could to give a semblance of a flat chest. And everything that she did, she just got in trouble for it, right? And that was the first time I'd ever sat in a clinical setting with a trans person. This person had been dehumanized and had been made to feel less than and struggled. And because of that, there were suicidal thoughts, this connectedness, this burden. She didn't feel like she belonged. And there was a lot of institutional stuff that let her know she didn't belong. Or she belonged as long as we're going to belong you in a place, right? As long as you stay in your place, you belong, which isn't, of course, belonging, right? But I had no idea what I was doing, but I was the only guy in town, right? So luckily I had access to Google and I could find a few resources. But I think the most important thing was just, because I didn't know and she let me know what was happening, all I needed to say was, help me see your world through your eyes. Help me see it how you see it. I once went to a bishop to talk about my struggles being gay, and he said, I want to see it through your eyes. What do I need to know about you so that I can be of help and of assistance? And for 2 hours I talked, and he said nothing. He nodded, he was affirming, and he gave me a giant bear hug at the end, and he says, let's meet again in 2 weeks. I don't want to say anything out of turn. I need 2 weeks to think. I'm like, thank you. And he took his own dissonance and he held it close to his heart, and he took that home with him, and he took that to God. And when he came back, we had a really kind of lovely meeting. And I think that is honestly, like, when we humanize people that have been othered, we go a long way into kind of healing and help them feel like they belong, like there's a place. And that's ultimately kind of what we're doing. With this trans woman in my clinic in Iraq, I helped her feel like, at least for an hour a week while you're in this space, you belong here. I didn't tell her out loud, I don't know what the hell to do with you, but you belong here, right? But I knew that I just needed to give her a space where she could be her most masculine self. And we got through the suicide crisis, and I worked with her for a little while, and then she dropped off the treatment plan, which happens. I run a program that I hope people graduate from, and she graduated, and I hope is out there doing well. But there's a lot to be said for not knowing and then saying you don't know, right? And I didn't know, and I kind of gave that space. I think someone told me once that the Holy Ghost will not affirm the answers that you make up on the fly. But if your answer is, I don't know, and that is truthful, the Holy Ghost can confirm the truthfulness of the answer, I don't know. And it's powerful to hear, I don't know. So I'd encourage, especially faith leaders who are kind of relying on the Holy Ghost's inspiration, to rely on the statement, I don't know, but help me understand. I want to know. I want to know. I often tell people that I'm not coming out of the closet. I'm inviting them in. And it's an invitation. And not everyone wants to come in, and that's great. I don't have room for everyone that wants to come in. But for those who do want to come in and want to come into my world and see things how I see them, it's great. I'd love to have you here. I invite you in. Like it says on the churches, visitors welcome. But I'm not going to require anyone in that space that doesn't want to be in that space with me. Yes, got a question over here.
Not so much a question. I guess I just want to share what I'm thinking out loud. Mm-hmm. On our previous session with Mike, talked about the GPS, God, people, and self.
Yeah.
This must be hell. You're struggling with self constantly. How do you fit in there? I don't understand it. I'm just it's got to be a hopeless feeling. And that's terrible, terrible. It's just an outward thought. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you. And it certainly can be. And that's why that hopelessness is a mediating factor, right? I'm struggling and I don't see any way out of this. It's black. I can't, there's not a light or a train at the end of the tunnel. It just is. It feels like that time outside of Flagstaff, Arizona, when I walked into a lava tube and hiked for a mile and a half and just found the inside of a mountain. That's all I found. And I have felt that way, right? I found a wall. Congratulations, and I've got a mountain on top of me, and I started thinking about that, and I immediately got out of the lava tube because my claustrophobia kicked in, right? So that does happen. And I will say I had an understanding of myself as an adolescent that matched my understanding of an adolescent. And in my early 20s, I had a different understanding of myself. I remember the first time I wanted to learn about this, and my therapist at BYU gave me some books to read, but I was too afraid to go check them out of the library. So I checked out 3 gay books and 9 books on human sexuality. I had 12 total books. That way I could plausible deniability. I'm doing a research project on human sexuality, and I slipped the gay ones in kind of every 3rd book. It's very calculated. I walked out of the atrium, and I put all the books back that I didn't want, and I walked out of the library with the 3 that I did. Right, there was that much fear, right? But I developed an understanding that matched my development as a human, and it was true. And then in my 30s, I had a different understanding, and that was also true, right? As a 51-year-old, now I have a different understanding, and that's also true. And all these versions of myself were true because they matched the place that I was at. And so I think what we're helping people do is find the truth for them. And I'm not necessarily speaking of moral relativism, but I'm just saying, every person has their own unique perspective that is true for them. One day, I walked out of the BYU bookstore one day, and I had never lived in the mountains. I grew up mostly back east. My dad's also military. And I walked out, and the mountains were just perfect. Like the snow was there, the clouds had parted, the sunset gave it orange and purple and pink, and I stood there. I couldn't believe how beautiful it was. And then I noticed that there was a woman standing next to me staring at the exact same thing, right? And then all of a sudden, I'm 18. I didn't have good conversational skills. But it felt awkward that we were both standing there looking at the exact same thing, and I felt like I needed to say something. And so I said, well, it's so beautiful, isn't it? And she goes, about 5 years ago, my fiance threw himself from those cliffs. So there we were in the same time, same space, same visual stimulus, and we could not have been further apart in our experience, right? But it was true for her. That was a moment of tragedy, untold tragedy, and for me, it was God affirming this beautiful place that I'm in, right? I did not know what to say, and so I walked away because I don't know what to do with that at 18. Helping people kind of sit in the place of understanding and truth and validating each place that they're kind of in is going to be important because, again, this is going to help them not feel that rejection, not feel that the way that they are is somehow inherently wrong, right? I want to kind of get to some other things that kind of come up with, at least with this particular model, but we want to help people feel like they belong. I kind of have covered most of this stuff. But we need higher levels of social supports to help people to help them connect. And there are programs. The VA does have an LGBTQ resource office with their own treatment plans and care, and I love that. There are groups for senior LGBTQ veterans, and they go on walks together, and they do really cute old people stuff, and I can't wait to join them someday and do cute old people stuff. But that connection is really high, and especially with transgender veterans. I was privileged to be on a float for LGBTQ veterans in the Pride Parade one year. And we had a trans woman who was a Marine in Vietnam. As far as like trans women go, she was badass. I would never mess with her. And she was given the American flag to march with, and she marched proudly that whole parade route. And you get to the part of the Pride Parade where they let the protesters stand. And there were 3 of them, and they were loud. And they said, God hates trannies, God hates fags. And they were very vocal in their disapproval of this woman and yelling at her, "You're not worthy to carry that flag." Right? We get to the end of the parade route, and I'm like, "I am so sorry. That's awful." And she said, "Sorry for what?" I'm like, "Those people." And she goes, "Didn't you hear the 150,000? Okay, right on. She heard the 150,000 that were cheering her on. Those 3 didn't matter to her. I learned something very powerful that day about, again, resiliency and strength, right? And yeah, that was a very humbling lesson for me. I do want to mention as well, just sort of racial and ethnic minority populations as well, that this also kind of loads on to these sense of being kind of a burden on others, the disparity. We know they face higher rates of suicide, especially the Asian American and Pacific Islanders have a much, much higher, 350% higher rate than the national average. We do know that Black and Hispanic veterans are about twice the rate of the national average. So again, why might this be the case? And in some instances, we do know there is still institutional racism, and racism that still kind of occurs within the military and in that population and with veterans. Again, we know from like minority stress theories, and if you're not familiar with that, it's a good to kind of like look into, but that there are some specific stressors that minority populations kind of face. And especially if you're a minority, that you can't hide from your minority status. I blend in quite nicely, right? No one has to know about my minority status unless I let them know, right? But not every minority can hide. It's very present. It's very demonstrably present, especially with, and when you can't hide from that, you're kind of always on guard, right? Always on edge, and you're always looking for, your head's kind of on a swivel, right? Because of just the racism that's kind of inherent in our country and our population. And when these things start to have intersections, right, where racial minority meets gender minority or sexual minority or religious minority, right, then the rates even go higher because, again, it makes it that much harder perhaps to connect and find those that are your people. Who's my tribe? Who are my people? When that gets thwarted, again, that's where the thoughts of suicide start coming in. Like, what's the point of being here if I don't have these reciprocating relationships? A few other kind of systemic challenges. Again, with these systemic challenges, it loads on that burdensomeness, it loads on the belongingness. They did a lot of work, and they've done a lot of work to kind of reduce the hazing behavior that is sort of like the military is kind of known for. And I was kind of disheartened to see that some of that hazing regulation is getting rolled back, because what I saw, even when it was outlawed, was pretty rough. And it's only going to contribute more to that sense of belongingness if we allow the hazing behavior to kind of go through. Oh, I had a question in the back, Brian. Yeah, some of the generational differences.
Sorry, the
Oh, yeah.
video needs the question. Address the point on the slide about the disparities across generations real quick. Thanks.
Yeah, so we do know that with some of the Vietnam vets, as they're kind of aging again, the hopelessness can really kind of kick in when you are in your 70s and you look left and right and you've driven people from your life and you're single, you're estranged from your kids, your body hurts, right? You have constant migraines, mobility is down, the loss of hearing. All these things as you're aging, right, which are realities of most people who are aging, but without that connectedness, with a lot of the Vietnam vets in particular that had kind of a rough go at it, you start to lose hope that it's ever going to get better. So the hopelessness comes back into effect for the 70-plus crowd. And so we see that suicide rates kind of like go up, and they sort of peak in the 40s and 50s. They kind of drop back down, but then they just start curving back up again in the 70s, right? And it's a population that can be quite difficult. How do you give somebody hope, right, when they don't have a lot of years left, right? When I've got someone in their 20s who's like, I had a breakup and I'll never find true love again, I can I can help them through that process much more easily than a 75-year-old who's like, in fact, I had a very high-ranking NCO come in. He was ready to retire. He was 60, over 60, and the military's like, you have to leave now, right? And he realized he had 8 children, and none of them talked to him. And he had an ex-wife somewhere. And he was like, I have nobody, right? What hope do I have? And so again, that's that little tick that starts to pick back up again when they start to feel hopelessness about connectedness. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have a question with the Black and Hispanic veterans who rates PTSD, and I'm wondering, I don't understand why they would have more PTSD. Are they exposed to more, or is because of compounding all the other experiences?
Yeah, kind of in a nutshell, we do know that Black and Hispanic soldiers are often put in more dangerous situations. They're given more missions, and they're more on the tip of the spear, especially a generation ago with the Vietnam vets, right? Higher proportion of Black and Hispanic recruits were put into frontline positions. They were less likely to be officers, and they were less likely to be higher-ranking NCOs. So there's that component. The other component that we know with the younger generation is the greatest predictor of PTSD developing with a combat-related trauma is childhood trauma. If there's childhood trauma that then gets compounded with combat trauma, those soldiers and veterans are more likely to develop PTSD. And so, again, higher levels of exposure to traumatic events in minority populations comes from being more likely to be coming from impoverished neighborhoods with lack of services, single-parent households. Within that minority population is pretty well documented. And so having had that, then the trauma that occurs when they are in the military on that already sort of shaky foundation will lead to higher rates of PTSD and then also higher rates of suicide. Does that make sense? That's a very long question, or a very long answer to kind of get into, but that's kind of the nuts and bolts of it. And so we're definitely kind of watching out for that. And I do assess pretty heavily childhood trauma to kind of understand what do we have that we are working with as far as resiliency and strength. Because also with trauma comes post-traumatic growth. So we shouldn't always assume that trauma equals damage, right? In fact, higher levels of PTSD also predict higher levels of post-traumatic growth. When they interviewed in 1985, a great study came out that they interviewed a bunch of Vietnam vets who had survived the Hanoi Hilton that were POWs in Vietnam. They were captured and tortured for years. And about a decade or so after they were released, this research group wanted to kind of interview and see what was going on. They wanted to find out about mental health status, relationship status, substance abuse status, PTSD, and they found all those things. But then they also found something kind of curious, that they were also saying, but the grass is greener. My wife's cooking is way better. I appreciate food more. And in fact, and this is what kind of blew my mind, 65% of the responders said they were grateful for their time in captivity because they have a greater appreciation for life. 35% were like, screw that sucked. but the majority said that they appreciated that time for what they learned from it. Isn't that remarkable? So as we're kind of talking with and ministering to people who have gone through some stuff, we're not only looking for how we can support through whatever damage that they're kind of suffering, but how do we bring out and see and recognize indices of growth, right? And that's going to help kind of protect them as well. I wanted to kind of touch on one, let's see, moral injury, because I think this is the kind of the final bit that we are seeing and kind of working with a lot lately. Moral injury is kind of a term that was more recently coined, and it has to do with events that either one perpetrates, fails to prevent, or bears witness to, or even learns about actions that go against their deeply held moral beliefs. In some cases, you go to a place like Kandahar or Iraq or the Mekong Delta, right? And you engage in behaviors there that you come back to Utah Valley, Happy Valley, and you evaluate your behavior with the morality here of a situation that happened there. And you think, what kind of a person have I become? Right? And this loads especially into the spirituality question, do I belong at church? I have committed acts of atrocity that I will never be forgiven for. What's the greatest I mean, the greatest sin you can commit is murder, right? And that's reinforced across multiple faith traditions. It's also the only crime you can commit and get a death sentence for in our country, right? It's the worst thing that you can do. And these soldiers often are asked to make really hard choices. I worked with a man for a number of years. They were taking sniper fire in Afghanistan, and he was the forward observer. And he says, the sniper's coming out of this building. Clock the building, send it up to artillery. They launched the rounds. They got rid of the sniper. And then when they inspected the building, they found 2 families, women, children, who were also murdered in that attack or killed in that attack. And he's like, I caused the murder of women and children that had nothing to do with the war, right? And that was, for him, a grave moral injury that he could never recover for. It's a story that he would never tell his wife. Because if she knew what I was capable of, right, moral injury. It's sort of that shattering of your own ethical or moral expectations. And it can be intentional or unintentional, right? It could be the bearing witness of and not saying anything. One young man that I worked with was in the platoon in Afghanistan where they were collecting ears of the enemy combatants and putting them on necklaces because he had a sociopath as a platoon sergeant. And he was a private with no voice in that particular power dynamic. Up against a sociopath, but he bore witness to these events. He never took part in it, but he bore witness to it. And he was found guilty of not reporting it, and he was court-martialed out of the military. Of course, the whole team was, but this young man, just by not saying something, so he carried that moral injury as well. And we know that this will, when we're talking about issues of morality and ethics, this is going to really kind of go across the scope of faith practices, of mental health practices, to really kind of dive into this, right? There's a whole paradigm on how to treat moral injury, kind of sit with this, but kind of one of the basic gists of it is helping a person accept that what is, right? And to be very mindful of that judgmental self that wants to criticize what you did then and there based on what you know here and now, right? Eventually, this young man learned that those 2 families that were killed in the artillery strike, the burden of that was on the sniper who chose to use a sniper position with women and children in the building. And he came to that. It took a couple years. I knew that at the beginning, right? I couldn't give that to him. He had to figure that out. So I sat with him for 2 years until he figured that out, right? Because what is. What has happened has happened. But we do talk about engaging in acts of moral engagement, right? So for him, because he caused the building to be destroyed, he decided to engage in HUD homes and building homes for people that needed housing. And so he got involved in kind of we call it restorative justice. And he engaged in acts of restorative justice. He would help anyone with a home improvement project because he was very good at that. And he built. He spent the rest of his time that I knew him building to kind of, not to make up for, but to engage in this restorative justice. But with the moral injury, the guilt and shame are associated with increased suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. And we know that these things, so there's a great study that kind of came out that did look at moral injury and suicide specifically, and found that acts of commission that you actually engage in load higher on suicide attempts and suicide thoughts, right? Yeah, so these are kind of things that we are kind of currently looking on and working to kind of treat. We're developing some good paradigms for understanding moral injury and helping soldiers and veterans understand this. But I think this often happens again with any population, right? I'm going to use kind of the veteran population, but there are moral injuries that occur every day out on the freeways, right? When people engage in behaviors that don't stack up with their own morality. Right? And we're all sinners. So at any point, we engage in behaviors that go against our moral values, right? And as we kind of sit with people, okay, so that did happen. Yeah, you did that thing. What are we going to do about it? Guilt is okay. Guilt is just the emotion that teaches you that something that you did is outside of your moral conduct. Shame is not helpful. It's destructive because it tells you not the thing that you did was wrong, but that you are wrong. You are bad. Shame is what the adversary told Adam and Eve, quick, hide, right? That's the first great commandment of Lucifer, was to hide, right? That's shame. And that doesn't help anyone. Because in that hiding space, that moral injury grows and compounds, and then more behavior tends to ensue from that, and it can really kind of spread like cancer. And these things then start loading on that suicidal thinking, right? If no one can know about this, right, then my connections, my belongingness is now thwarted on that level because I can't be seen. I won't be seen, because if I'm seen, what will they think of me, right? And then you start seeing yourself as a less moral person, and therefore a burden on those around you, and you don't want to engage in people. So moral injury starts to kind of load onto this. And again, a lesson that's applicable to any kind of population that we serve, because moral injuries are occurring kind of all the time. Yes. Speaking to my tie.
With the overlap of the LGBTQ population and the religion that we have around here, if we have a local church leader here who may be working with someone who's LGBTQ who might feel that they have committed a moral injury or something that doesn't align with that, whether that's someone who is trans, who is maybe exploring gender expression and then feels that that doesn't align with their values, or someone participating in any kind of same-sex romantic behavior, what would you recommend to a church leader when they're hearing about this and when someone's coming to them seeking guidance?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, again, allowing space for someone to kind of evaluate themselves. How does that make you feel? How does that kind of asking more questions and being less prescriptive, right? So you're dating someone. I'd love to hear about them. Tell me about the person you're dating. Right? Asking questions and getting the person kind of talking. Because again, we want people to be seen and feel like they're not going to be judged for things, right? And I think like with the example with gender expression, help me understand kind of how you see yourself. How do you feel God sees you? And we're going to be asking a lot more questions and not rushing to solutions. Right? Because I guarantee that by the time a trans or queer person comes into a bishop's office or a minister's office, they have thought long and hard about this, way more than the church leader has, perhaps, right? Because they've sat with it, they've prayed about it, they've fasted about it, they've gone to the temple, they've gone to their worship services with this on their mind over and over and over again. So the best thing we can do is ask questions. What inspiration have you received that I should know about so I can minister to you better? And then they'll be seen, and they'll feel connected instead of rejected. Yeah.
I really, really appreciate the story you told where, thank you. You talked about you knew he needed to get there, and you needed to give him 2 years to get there. And it's easy to say we don't offer solutions and we don't fix. 2 years is a lot of conversations, and it's a long time.
Yes.
For the rest of us, how do we develop the resilience to stay in that space without the desire to go like, get there faster, I know what you need, I want to tell you?
Well, that's a great question, because I know that my role is as a therapist, right? And I have my own training as a psychologist, right? To not provide things, but to help them understand how they arrive at their own stuff. As friends, as family members, as church leaders, as coaches in other fields, you do have maybe a broader way of maybe directing someone towards bibliotherapy or things to kind of read or consider, to kind of share. But I think it always starts with a posture of help me see you how you see you. And if you start from there, then any advice that you have will be more readily received. So my bishop, after 2 weeks, came back and he had some really good suggestions for me. And I knew that he had thought about it. And even though he had 2 weeks with it and I had 35 years with it, he made up a lot of ground in those 2 weeks, and I appreciated that effort, right? And people will appreciate it if we kind of take that time. We're kind of out of time. 11:45, okay. We'll go for a little bit longer. No, I think 11:30 is the break and then 11:45 is lunch. I don't want to be the thing that stops you from lunch. Right? And there's also a musical number that was promised, and I don't want to be the thing that stops you from hearing some good music. Listen to the music, though, and listen for the tension and resolution, because music is all about tension and resolution, right? And the longer that tension is held, I'll give you an example. There's a beautiful choral piece written by David Whitaker called When David Heard. and it describes the moment that David heard about the death of his son Absalom. The composer creates an 18-note chord, 18 notes, all stacked on top of each other. He wrote this for BYU and BYU singers because the director of BYU singers, Ron Staley, had his son die twice, actually. Was hit by a train on his mission. They knew he was dead, but he somehow survived and came back home, and was in a car accident and died 6 months after coming back home from his mission. So he lost his son twice. And so Eric Whitaker wrote this piece when David heard and had BYU singers premiere it. But it has 18 notes on top of each other because sometimes it's really heavy. And he holds it, and he holds it, and he holds it, and he does even more than what Beethoven would do. Beethoven would be proud of this chord, right? If we can sit in places of tension until they resolve, the resolution is that much more gratifying. So look it up on YouTube. Try to find the BYU Singers performance because I think it's the most honest performance. It was premiered when I was an undergrad. I was a music major at BYU once upon a time. And they premiered it, and it was really powerful. So try to find that recording. But again, I would encourage you to sit with the tension, sit with the discomfort, right? And if they see that you can do it, then they feel like they can do it as well. And that's kind of what I kind of hope for. Thank you so much for your attention today. I appreciate it.